Hi, I'm Max Clark. I'm a recovery network engineer, and I've been building networks for more than 25 years. And I would never buy a firewall again. And I would tell you, you probably should never buy a firewall either. Okay, it's a controversial statement, but let's get into it, right? But Max, I need to spend $80,000 on a pair of fill-in-the-blank really big firewalls from Palo Alto, Cisco, Meraki, Fortinet, SonicWall, whatever, right? No, you don't. 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 First off, again, I've been doing this for a long time. 25 years ago, we needed a firewall to do three things for us, right? We needed a firewall to do network address translation, to do NAT. By the way, it's not really NAT, it's really PAT. But, you know, Google NAT versus PAT, and maybe I'll record another video. But we needed the firewall to do NAT because we had private IP space running inside the office, and we had a very small number of public IPs, and you have to translate your private IP space to your public IP space in order to talk to the internet. Okay, so the firewall does NAT for you. That was the first thing. Second thing the firewall did for us is we had services hosted inside our network. Usually we had an Exchange server, we had a network Novell GroupWise server, we had Lotus Notes, we had Domino, we had a FTP site, we had a web server, we had something, you know, we had a remote desktop, you know, virtual desktop, whatever it was, right? An RDP server that was running inside of our network and that we needed to expose to the internet. And so how do you do that? Same thing in reverse, right? You create a NAT rule and you translate, you map, you do a static mapping of a public IP address and port combination to an inside resource. And the third thing that we use these firewalls for was to create and enforce policy, right? So if you're running an Exchange internally, right, you were allowing SMTP port 25 in. If you had a firewall, you know, as port 20 and 21. If you're running a web server, as port 80 and 443, right? So you would say, allow this traffic from these sources to come into our network. Okay, there's a fourth thing, right? A lot of times you're building a VPN and connecting multiple offices together in some kind of private networking or remote users, right? So we had this fourth rule, right? So we had NAT, internal and outside NAT, external and internal NAT, policy, and VPN. Let's just call that like our 1, 2, 3, 4 of what these firewalls do. Now, the dirty secret with most of these things is on the inside to outside policies. If you were in a regulated industry, maybe you had to be specific about the policy. Maybe you had to be really, really restrictive. But the majority of organizations and installations did not do that. When I say the majority, like 99% plus, their rule is allow anything from the inside to go anywhere on the outside. That was your policy. You know, so how sophisticated of a firewall do you have to do to have that? No, I mean, you don't. You don't have to have a sophisticated firewall to do that. By the way, I'm going to go on a tangent here for a second and talk about the craziest things I've seen with firewalls. Data centers, data center applications. You were in a data center and then it's, oh, we need to have a firewall to protect our web servers. You know, like, maybe in the dark ages, if you're running like Microsoft Windows, you needed, or, you know, in T4.0, you needed to do it because, you know, your server selection couldn't deal with it itself. But, you know, if you're running Linux or any of the BSD variants, you know, you have a firewall directly on the box. You can create policy on that server itself, right? Like allow port 80 and 443 from the internet. Don't allow anything else to connect to me. And you also guarantee you have a router or some sort of layer 3 device. Usually it's a switch with a layer 3 functionality on it or routing functionality onto it, and you can create ACLs on that switch. Why? Well, you know, here's the deal. If you've got a moderately sized data center infrastructure that you need to have protected, you're already buying the switch, you know, to connect your servers to it. So it's already sunk cost. It costs you $0 to enable ACLs on that switch. If you've got a moderately sized data center and you want to go out and you want to buy a big firewall, again, from, let's call it the big three, right? Cisco, Fortinet, or Palo. I did those in alphabetical order, by the way. You know, surprise, you're going to spend another $100,000, $200,000 plus annualized support in order to get a pair of firewalls. So now you've got these really big, obnoxiously expensive boxes that are doing very basic things for you. And by the way, you have to have them in pairs because you need redundancy. And then you have to do session state maintenance, you know, replication between the two firewalls. And that creates load on the firewall. And then you need to do, you know, and as your traffic increases, your requirement to have a bigger and bigger firewall increases. You have to spend even more money on the firewall. And then you're going to get to a point where you can't buy a big enough firewall or it's unfeasible for you to buy the firewall. So then you have to do firewall load balancing. So now you have to put load balancers on the outside of your firewalls and then load balancer, stack of firewalls, load balancer again, and do session state maintenance and session tracking between your firewalls on your load balancers. So that way, you know, each session only flows one way up and down. It's just crazy. You don't need to do it. Anyways, tangent aside. By the way, if you want to talk about this more, let me know. I'm really passionate about this topic, apparently, because I've gone off the rails already. Okay, so now let's talk about your office environment, right? Okay, so yes, offices still exist, right? People come into locations and do work. I had a client years ago, a VP of IT for a company, and he had the most elegant way of saying this. His phrasing was, you know, looking at his offices as fancy Starbuckses, in the sense of he needed to provide fast and stable network connectivity for his office to connect to the internet for people to come into the office and work and be happy at the office. And the observation was really around this place of nothing was hosted in the office anymore. If you're a relatively modern operation, right, you're 100% SaaS based for everything, right? Your productivity suite, 365 or workspace, cloud-based, file sharing cloud-based, CRM cloud-based, ERP or GL is cloud-based, your HR systems cloud-based, your applications that you're exposing to, whatever your application that you're serving is probably cloud-based or in a data center or in some sort of IaaS platform, right? Like modern enterprises don't run things on-premise for a reason. So now as soon as you take this on-premise thing away, you've now eliminated, let's go back to our list of 4 things, right, that your firewall is doing for you. You still need the inbound to outbound NAT. You now don't need the outbound to inbound NAT, and your policies change a lot. And also your VPN. Do you need to have a VPN connecting your offices if you're not running anything in your office? See how the firewall requirement basically very quickly goes down to inbound to outbound NAT connectivity and then policy for that. And again, most people aren't running any policies for the inbound to outbound NAT. So you're down to 1 function out of 4 that we really want this firewall out of. Why are you running a firewall? You can go to a basic SD-WAN box and get NAT and basic policy enforcement, and it's a lot cheaper than a firewall, and it does other cool things for you, which is like circuit selection based on, again, it's specific based on the type of SD-WAN that you buy. Gartner creates these definitions of SSE and SASE. Okay, what's the A that's the difference between SSE and SASE? A is the access layer, which is your SD-WAN. You probably want to go to SASE versus SSE and figure out your own SD-WAN on top of it. We can debate that for a different video. The point there is, modern times require modern just take a step into the future, right, in thinking and technique and approach. If your users can be in your office, can be remote, can be in another office, can be in a Starbucks, can be at their house, can be wherever they're going to be. They can be in their car, they can be at the beach, they can be in a hotel, they can be in a Starbucks, right? They can be wherever they're going to be, one of which can be your office. You're going to want to have the same infrastructure, security controls, policies exist in all the different places, right? The perimeter isn't centralized, right? You're not running a castle with a moat with a drawbridge anymore that you can say, okay, everything comes in and out here. Other example that was horrible for firewalls, and really also some service providers do this, and you should ask this question if you're talking to them, because you shouldn't do business with these service providers. Old Stargate telcos would go out and buy these big chassis firewalls and co-locate them in their infrastructure and in a geographic location. And if you were an LA-based company, they would pin you to a firewall in Los Angeles because that's where you were based. But then if you had users in New York, those users in New York have to connect to Los Angeles and then go back to stuff in New York. I mean, that sounds bad. It's even more extreme. Your CFO goes on vacation to, the Greek islands and now is trying to do work, and it's Greece to Los Angeles back out, right? Like, all true stories. I've seen these things. Firewall manufacturers will give you all these sorts of crazy cockamamie things that you should really care about. Like, you should care about DPI and you should care about UTM. And by the way, if you care about DPI and UTM and you enable on your firewall, you're going to crush that firewall. That firewall, it's going to be appearing, just run along, chug. You turn it on, it goes, and it just dies, right? And then you find out that you have to invest in more and more resources and buy bigger and bigger firewalls. And then you just turn it off, right? Like, every time I've seen somebody enable DPI, I've just seen it turn it off. Anyways, so we start talking about modern applications and modern infrastructure and modern policy enforcement. So what do you want out of modern infrastructure? Well, if you have SaaS applications, you want to protect them. How do you protect them? You want data loss prevention, DLP, and you want CASB. You want to be able to restrict traffic and connectivity to your cloud environment. By the way, DLP and CASB are going to be available to you in any sort of modern SASE solution, right? Like, okay, so DLP, CASB. You don't get DLP. You don't necessarily get CASB. You can kind of fake CASB if you've got perimeter-based firewalls, but it's not real CASB. There's no firewall in the market that does DLP for you. You're going to want a secure web gateway. Maybe you're going to want a secure web gateway with remote browser inspection, right? So you've got SWG with RBI. Firewalls don't give you this option. And why do you want to run SWG and RBI? Because you want to protect your users from all the nefarious junk that's on the internet trying to take advantage and just do bad things to you at all the times, right? And SWG and RBI are ways of just preventing things from happening before you even have to worry about whether or not your EDR catches it or if you can unwind it, right? So SWG and RBI. What else do you want? You want to move into zero trust. So you want to do ZTNA, right? You want to move from antiquated VPN that's just complete garbage and doesn't give you any real entitlement and policy, controls, to a real session software-defined perimeter or ZTNA solution. And now you want to take all this infrastructure, right? Imagine this we're going to draw a cloud around my head here, actually it's Madonna, but and you want to have the same infrastructure regardless of where your users are. If you have an office in LA, an office in New York, an office in London, an office in Johannesburg, you have users on vacation in Tokyo, you want to prevent people from connecting when they're in New Mexico, like whatever you want to do, you want to be able to create these policies and you want to have them unified and you want to have controls. And by the way, when you go to something modern, again, not a firewall, we haven't even talked about maintenance and updates. Oh boy, let's talk about that one for a second. Your firewall vendor announces a severe critical exploit, just do a Google search on this one. This happens all the time. Hopefully it can be replaced, it can be updated with a firmware update. We've seen some recently where it was, you've got to replace the box. Like you've got a firewall, you've got to replace it with a new box because it's just not firmware updatable. Now, what's your change management process? Okay, you've got a firmware update. You have to test the firmware. Do you have to wait a certain amount of time before you can apply the firmware just to make sure that the firmware is okay? Do you have to schedule a maintenance window? Does the maintenance window have to be approved? Can it only happen on the third Tuesday of the month after the full moon? Like, what's your actual criteria for applying the firmware? How long does it take to apply? Who's doing the work? How many firewalls do you have? You have a pair of firewalls. Okay, let's say it takes you an hour each firewall. You've got to have an engineer that's going to be now in your maintenance window, which is probably after 10 p.m. up at night. Means they can't work during the day because you're going to have them working overnight, right? They're not going to be functional for you during the day. They have to do an update. Okay, it takes a couple hours to do the update. Let's say it goes well, everything's great. Let's say it doesn't go well, it has to figure out how to get rolled back. Well, now, let's say you have remote offices. Let's do a basic one. You've got 2 firewalls per location. You've got 10 locations. You've got 20 firewalls. How long does it take you to roll out 20 firewalls? That's 10 locations with 2 firewalls. Maybe you're in your retail. You've got 500 locations with 1 firewall each. How long does that take you to roll out? 2,000 locations? It's not even like a linear issue here. This becomes like a logarithmic problem. Like the more that you have, and by the way, you're trying to get this update applied. And meanwhile, the exploit's in the wild, which means people are looking for vulnerable firewalls, which means for each day you don't apply this update, you're just being discovered and you're being abused. Versus, a SASE platform, which might be able to apply that update instantaneously for you. We saw this with Log4j. The Log4j exploit, WAF, cloud-based WAFs and SASE infrastructure were able to create rules and mitigate those attacks same day, and the people that were on-prem were waiting, and they were in a lot of pain. Anyways, don't buy hardware firewalls. Invest in modern infrastructure, protect your users, make your life easier, get yourself modern stuff. And by the way, the tooling is way cooler, right? If you're thinking about this from the standpoint of you want to have a fun toy to play with, the tooling for SASE is way cooler, and you can do way more interesting things with it, and you can manage it from anywhere. Literally, you can take your laptop, go on vacation on your yacht, and you can manage this infrastructure. And your users will like you so much better. They will like you anyways. I'm Max Clark. That's a little bit of a rant. I kind of went off the rails a few times, but hopefully it makes sense. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, you want to talk about it, comment below, send me an email, give me a call. Happy to discuss this with you at length. But that's why I would never buy a firewall again. Have a great day.
Feeling.